there is a pretty strong imbalance between, on the one hand, the student's demand for personalized instruction, and on the other hand, just the time that the teacher has to give them these students.
Hey guys, welcome. So this is going to be the first of hopefully many videos that we actually release, which is a series of interviews that we do with people who are teaching math, who are innovating around math, or anything to do with math education. And it's going to be primarily around people who do it for higher education, but sometimes we might also have high school teachers in there. So for this first one, we actually decided to start off with someone who's my colleague here at Sowiso. His name is Lars, and apart from teaching math at different universities, he also helps us actually write the math that we use in our learning tool. So basically with him, I want to kind of dive into what exactly is the so-called math problem that we're trying to solve as a company, and what he experiences as on a day-to-day basis as a teacher. So hopefully you enjoy, and let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments below. So, before we go into anything, tell me a bit more about yourself.
Okay, so my name is Lars van Boeijen, and I've now been working for Sowiso for 2.5 years as a math author. I'm not a mathematician though. I studied economics and psychology, and I guess the way I got interested in education is because I started out as a private tutor. It started in high school, just tutoring friends and people in my class. And then as I went to university, it became sort of a side job, just a way to make money. And I noticed that I really enjoyed teaching, especially in a one-to-one setting, so it's very personal. And throughout the years, I got more and more interested in education, and specifically the best ways to teach math. And towards the end of my study, I was sort of figuring out what I wanted to do next. And I sort of decided that I would dedicate my time towards figure out if there's a new way to teach math, specifically making use of new digital technology, the ways digital technology can innovate math education.
Right. So the first thing I want to touch upon there is that I have also had some teaching experience in the past. I taught at university, and same thing as you. In school, I was helping tutoring some students, etc. But the things I helped tutor was more English, history, philosophy, so more the humanities or the social sciences per se. Because for me, math is always one of those things I would just not go near. Like I would do the bare minimum just to get the grade, and that was it. Right? So the first thing I want to ask is there a difference? Because you kept on saying math education, and so just education in general.
Yeah.
Right. So is there some difference you would say to what you have to keep in mind while teaching math, as opposed to something that's a bit more softer, like history or philosophy?
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple points to make here, and probably the first thing to touch upon is that math is by design abstract. So it is sort of the translation of the world around us into numbers and symbols. And unfortunately, this is not something that we were built to do. So our brains developed over millions and millions of years, basically to survive in the jungle.
Right, yeah.
And you don't really need an intuitive understanding of fractions or logarithms in order to survive in the jungle. So, and if you sort of consider that the evolutionary timescale, then math might as well have been invented yesterday. So it's something very new that we weren't designed or developed to understand. And so I like to sort of use the analogy is that trying to learn math is trying to run the newest version on Windows on a really old computer.
Right.
And
that just shuts down.
Yeah, so I mean that in itself is sort of I guess a testament to the flexibility, the adaptability for brains that we can even learn math at all. But yeah, it does complicate things because it's not something that we haven't developed an intuition for a lot of these concepts.
Right.
So it takes a lot of time and effort to sort of build and develop these skills.
Right. So if you could compare that to something else, so would you say that we have a higher tendency to naturally pick up, let's say, history or philosophy?
Yeah. So there is a sort of a distinction to make there, and so what maybe sets math apart from sort of the more softer sciences that you mentioned, so history, philosophy, even psychology, is that math is really centered around skills as opposed to more knowledge-based disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that things like psychology or philosophy are easy or don't require skills at all, but with math, these skills can be very clearly defined. So I can, it's just knowing how to multiply fractions, knowing how to solve a system of equations, calculating the derivative of something. Whereas in these more knowledge-based disciplines, these skills are often less easily defined. So these disciplines involve more how do we process information, how do I structure and communicate my ideas, how do I write clear and concise texts. So whereas math, I can give you a worksheet at the end of the chapter where I can sort of, if you complete these 20 exercises, then I can clearly see you've mastered these skills. Whereas with more knowledge-based disciplines, these usually take the form of discussion groups or presentations or writing essays. And so in that sense, I like to compare learning math really like to learning an instrument. So it's really something that takes, that has to develop over a long period of time and takes really consistent and repeated practice over an extended period in order to achieve mastery.
Right. So was this also something because you have a background in psychology and economics? So when you were approaching these topics as a student, did you notice that you were trying to approach it in a different way to get to that mastery level? Could you see that in yourself?
Yes, no. So I guess it's like tackling knowledge of psychology or the topic of psychology is much more about how do I organize information? How do I store knowledge? So it's much more about structuring and organizing knowledge versus
and creating like maps of meaning.
Yeah, exactly. So something like a mind map is a great tool for something like philosophy or psychology, but it doesn't really translate well, or doesn't really work well in the domain of math because it's knowing how to do something or knowing sort of the rules or the things to apply is only the first step towards mastery. So if you sort of have memorized and completely understood a chapter from a psychology book, then you're basically there, right? So if you're taking an exam in philosophy, you'll probably be asked to present some knowledge or to structure an argument. Whereas with math, it's much more individual, little tiny skills that you sort of need to combine in order to become good at it.
Right. And is there a hierarchy for these skills? Like, is it more, or all of those skills are on the same level, and it doesn't matter, you need one skill for the next, or?
So that's another thing that sets math apart, or is important to mention, is that the degree to which these skills and concepts and rules are connected to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So math is a cumulative discipline. So every new skill, every new concept builds upon the things that came before it. So just as an example, Something like multiplication is really just a fancy way of adding numbers. So if we multiply 3 by 4, then really what we're doing in the background is we're adding 3 fours. Same thing with squaring a number, so multiplying by itself. Well, if you then go back to it, then that is also squaring a number is a special form of multiplication. Multiplication is a special form of addition. So you can sort of see that everything builds upon each other.
Right. So like for you to fundamentally grasp the arithmetic that's going on in squaring a number, you need to kind of understand what addition
Yeah,
is.
so the importance of mastering the fundamentals cannot be understated when it comes to math.
So I guess it's also why when you're in primary school, the first thing you learn is addition, right?
No, it has to be learned in a specific sequence.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a reason why you have to learn sort of the pre-algebra skills, so addition, multiplication, sort of your basic arithmetic operations, before you can move on to algebra, where things like variables are introduced and even more mathematical operators.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you've mastered algebra, which is sort of your basic toolkit of how to work with symbols and numbers, then you can move on to something more complicated like calculus. But you can't start with the calculus chapter and then sort of work your way back to pre-algebra. It has to be taught in a certain order, and really you need to, in order to master a more complicated subject, you really need to master all the things that came before it.
Right. And so this is how schools do it now, right? Or universities in general. So you, at least when I was in school, I was first taught addition, then subtraction, then I had to memorize these multiplication tables first.
So the structure is set up right in that sense. So I wouldn't change anything about the order in which math is taught.
Right. So
one of the sort of the dangers here, for example, is the idea of a passing grade in math.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have, so generally in high school or in universities, like a 55 or a 60%, at least here in the Netherlands, constitutes a passing grade, which is then supposedly meant to indicate that you master a subject to a particular degree. But the problem with setting a passing grade of 60% with math is that 40% that you then don't understand can show up years later when you're trying to tackle a more difficult subject.
Right.
So the importance of mastering the foundation, really the basic concepts, is really essential to mastering a discipline such as math.
So I would say, so this is kind of, if it was an educated guess, this is why you start tutoring people.
Yeah.
Is that because you just had better fundamentals and then you were not just getting passing grades as you're moving up in school, or?
Yeah, so I've always had an affinity for math. So you say, I mastered the fundamentals like as I went along, but
so you can add numbers.
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
But no, I guess especially with tutoring and with teaching math in general, it's not something that's often explicitly mentioned. So like the first thing that I always do in a tutoring session or when I'm teaching in general is just to try to get an idea of how well a student has mastered the fundamentals. And so the first thing you do is you fix the holes and the gaps in the fundamentals, and only then do you move on to.
Right, so you kind of diagnose them.
That really is sort of the first step. Definitely as a tutor, but definitely something I strive for when I'm teaching is to sort of first get an understanding of what the strengths and weaknesses are of each of the students, and then based on that you can structure the lessons that come after.
So when you were tutoring, you were kind of taking this approach, but probably not as defined as how you're saying it right now, but in a way for you to help your friend. If you just said, I need help in calculus.
Yeah, no, I mean, at least in my experience, like 9 out of 10 times when a student is struggling, say with chapter 11, it's not because there is suddenly a huge difficulty spike in chapter 11. So that the chapter 11 requires skills from chapter 4, 3, and 2. And so insufficient mastery in those basic topics will then show up as problems later on.
Right, and one of the biggest reasons why this problem still abides today is because of this idea of passing grades.
Yeah, I think it's especially in math, it can be quite harmful because ideally you wouldn't want students to move on to the next topic before they've mastered it. But the way this idea of passing grades are sort of set up is that students learn it, test it, and then sort of forget it. And while that might work for disciplines where certain subjects or certain chapters are more standalone, because everything is so connected in math, ideally you only want someone to move on to the next chapter when they completely mastered the previous ones.
Right. So in the ideal world, this is going out on a limb. So in the ideal world, would you be as radical as saying to get rid of this idea of passing and failing grades? Have you put some thought into that? What could be a potential?
There is sort of.
Or if there's people are already doing this out there, because.
Yeah, you do have some advocates of that said, well, we've got to get rid of this idea that by grade 4 you have mastered this, and when students get into the next grade, we're just going to assume that everything that was taught before that is known. So in that sense, a student would benefit a lot more from going back to the basics and filling any gaps in your strengths and weaknesses rather than moving on. Because I'd say that's probably it.
Yeah, right. So you were tutoring first in school while you were still studying. And then after that, you said you became a private tutor, where I'm guessing you refined these heuristics you have. So whenever someone came to you, because what was the majority of people who were coming to you asking for private tutor help? Were they high school students, or were they?
I'd say it's about 50-50 high school and university students. So high school students was mostly algebra and calculus, and then university students, at least the ones I taught, was mostly statistics.
Right.
So sort of more the applied version of mathematics.
And even there, you would say it's the same problem as with your classmates when you were in school. They did not have a grasp of the fundamentals.
Yeah, I'd say that is in 9 out of the 10 cases when you really dig down to why someone is not understanding it. It's not that this particular new rule or this particular new idea is suddenly so difficult that it requires more extra talent for math to sort of master this again, more complicated subject. It's really how well do I master the fundamentals, and how well am I able to combine these skills? So as math gets more complicated, I'd say the biggest spike in difficulty is not necessarily the new rules themselves, but the extent to which you need to combine and sort of...
right, because the backlog just keeps increasing.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And then when it comes to mastering any of these things, right, so because you've helped these kids when you were doing your high school tutoring sessions and afterwards private tutoring, and then right now you're doing some lectures at universities. What's the roadmap to mastery? Like, what should ideally a student do to master? Let's keep it really simple. Like, just he's going to come with you saying, I don't get algebra. You're going to first say, well, that means you don't get X or Y fundamental skill, and then how do I master the X or Y fundamental
Well, ideally you'd go back to an old textbook or sort of revisit the old material, and then fix that first. And once the foundation is rigid and set, then move on.
So ideally, what you want is for these students to master a set number of these fundamental skills by the time they're out of high school.
Yeah, so I'd even go as far as to say that it is much more preferential to sort of master a smaller number of topics. Let's just say there are 15 chapters. I'd rather have a student that's mastered the first 10 than that has partially mastered the first 15, if you get what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just easier to sort of build on a strong foundation than sort of trying to plug holes into,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So would you say, like, and again, this is maybe generalization, but in your minds, are there certain things you judge, like what needs to be done on a high school level? Could you give me a couple of examples of what a student ideally would need in that, what is it, like 15 years of education?
You mean purely math-wise?
Math-wise.
So sort of the topics?
Yeah, topics.
I'd say, so for me as someone who teaches like a first year university course math, I'd say, pre-algebra and algebra are probably the two domains that you really want students to get. So I have no, so when you sort of start teaching a topic from calculus, you basically start from zero. So I'd much rather have someone who's, fully mastered the foundation rather than someone who's maybe dabbled a bit of calculus during high school.
Right. So algebra is kind of like where you draw the line.
Yeah. So I mean, at least for
your specific kind.
Yeah. So for the course that I'm teaching now, but in general, I'd say if students leave high school having mastered algebra, then me as a university teacher would be very happy to sort of pick up the
and then right now you're teaching calculus, and then before at one point you were also teaching statistics, right?
Yes.
And then what degrees are these tied to? These are not pure math degrees, I'm assuming.
No, not at all.
Right.
So it's mostly teaching math to non-math majors, if you will, which is challenging in itself because these are often the students, if we've given the choice, they'd rather not do math.
I was one of those.
So, I mean, there's definitely a challenge in that, but.
And when it comes to non-math majors, is it mainly one or two different type of majors, or is it everything from engineering to economics?
For maths, I'd say it's maybe not as broad as something as statistics. So nowadays, basically doesn't really matter what you decide to study, you will sooner or later run into statistics. So I'd say that's has an even broader audience, so to speak. But for math, it's mostly something like economics or finance, a bit more numerical based disciplines.
Right, and what do these students look like? If you could say in terms of their math prowess, right? How are they when you first day of class?
That's one of the most difficult things is that you often end up with 20, 30, or at least in university maybe even 100 students, all with varying profiles of strengths and weaknesses. So
right. So even if the university said, okay, we only admit you if you have a high school diploma A or high school diploma B.
But then again, right? You run into this problem of a passing grade. So
right. So that's where it kind of.
If you have a passing grade for math, then that means you could pass your exam without understanding 40% of the content.
Right. So even if a university filters students by their high school diploma, or if it's IB or with Abitur or whatever it is, there's still some kind of loophole there because this passing failing
there's
system.
Always going to be students, like every student has some combination of strengths and weaknesses, and for some students they only have a few weaknesses, but for others there are very significant gaps in their knowledge, and then depending on the course you're teaching, some skills might be more important than others, but in general you're faced with a large group of very diverse students when it comes to math ability.
Right. So what does this actually mean in terms of, overall it would be what does it mean for the teachers, what does it mean for the students, and what does it mean for the university? But I guess we can start with students, for example. So what does this mean if you're showing up in first year with passing grades in math?
Well, first of all, is that you're probably going to struggle. Like if you don't take the time to fix these holes in your knowledge, then you're going to start falling behind.
But can't I rely on the same things I relied on in high school, in the sense that I just scrape by and get that pass? Or is getting a pass harder?
It's getting harder and harder, right? Because as math gets more complex, you're combining more and more skills. So whereas maybe for a relatively simple topic, you might be combining 3 to 5 skills. Well, maybe if you haven't mastered 1 or 2, you can sort of skip by or sort of get where you need to go. But as soon as things start involving maybe 10 to 15 skills, then all of a sudden, there's a sort of a threshold where you...
Right, so it sounds stupid when I say it out loud, but so scraping a pass in a first year university degree math course is much harder than scraping a pass.
As a general rule, as the math gets more complex, this idea of sort of scraping by without fully understanding the foundations is going to get harder and harder and harder.
What happens to the students who are struggling with these things? Do they end up doing multiple resets? Do they end up dropping out of the major?
It differs. So some students are keen to giving up. So some will sort of panic in the first 2 weeks and then try to get out. But I think that one of the main responsibilities as a teacher when you're giving a new group of students is to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of your students and see what you can do to strengthen the foundation before moving on. As to what students do, it really differs per student.
Right, but I remember we had a conversation about this earlier. There are still, on a really high level, certain groups you can put them in.
You have different types of students,
Mm-hmm.
and these different types of students have different needs. So, you in every class you'll have a group of maybe 10-15% of really high performers. These are just kids who did well in high school who will undoubtedly do well in math subjects going forward.
But these are the kids that make your job easy.
Right. So easy, but maybe not as fun, because these are children that, in my experience, usually just want to be left alone.
Right.
They don't show up to lectures. They just give me the homework and I'll hand it in by the end of the week. So.
And probably the other kids see that as an example, and that kind of has.
So that can be frustrating, right? When you see someone else who's clearly struggling less than you are. But in general, if you consider what are the challenges of teaching math, and this top group of performance is generally not something that really worries you. Then there's the big middle pack, I'd say. So this is the overwhelming majority of your class is sort of the middle of the pack students, which I'd say the biggest challenge for these students is to actually get them to put in the work. So if they have gaps in their foundation, to get them to fix those, but also during the course to have them practice each week consistently, and at all costs avoid this idea of I'm just going to cram 2 weeks before my exam, because where that might work for something like psychology or philosophy, really if you want to master a certain skill by week 8, you really need to start practicing in week 1. So I'd say the biggest challenge with these students is to get them to consistently put in the hours, and then there's of course sort of the technical support, if you will, to give them. So it's a personalized instruction, seeing what they're struggling with and sort of guiding them towards resources that can help them fix these struggles. And then there's the last group of students, and these are your students that are not only struggling with the material themselves, but also usually have a certain emotional reaction to math. So these are the students who get really stressed out, who have experienced math anxiety throughout high school, and who sort of, the mind just goes blank as soon as they start noticing that that they're falling behind. And these are the students that generally require the most attention and time. So besides the technical instruction, these students also really benefit from more emotional support. Sitting down with them, really trying to see what is scaring them and what you can do to help them to pass the course.
Right. So and when these three types of students come into your class, are you able to give all of them? Well, the first group, you don't really have to give them much attention, but are you able to give the other two groups of students the kind of attention that will be needed for them to master?
Yeah. So I mean, time is the most precious resource as a teacher, I would say. So in generally, you have very little time to spend with students, and one of the key things that I like to think about is there really is no replacement for one-to-one instruction when it comes to math.
Right. So ideally, you're striving for that private tutor setting.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, if you could give every student a private tutor, then there really is no reason why a student shouldn't be able to pass a specific course, unless they're so behind from high school. Let's say your average student, there's no reason. Give enough time and enough support that these students can pass the course.
Right. Because what exactly a private tutor does is that he or she's able to diagnose where you are, identify the gaps, and then prescribe more customized.
Yeah, but sort of the first thing that you mentioned that's really important. So sort of getting an idea of what the type of student is that you're dealing with, and especially figuring out what the strengths and weaknesses are of the student is at least in a private tutor setting, is always the first step.
Right.
But these are very time intensive things to do.
And this is why probably a university teacher most likely won't have time.
No, so in university, like you're just because of the sheer number of students, you're sort of forced to assume that they've mastered the topics that they need in order to tackle more complicated subjects. Simply because, at least with traditional learning materials, if you would have to go in and profile each and every student's strengths and weaknesses, then the half of the course would be over, and there's only 4 weeks left to learn.
Right, because most of these university courses, they run the course of, let's say, 8 weeks or 9 weeks.
Let's say 8 weeks.
Yeah, and then you have a certain amount of material you have to cover, and for example, the class that you're teaching, how many hours, contact hours do you get with the students on a weekly basis?
So right now I only give the lectures, so I have 2 hours each week, and then they have, I think, one work group of 3 hours, and then they use a digital tool to sort of help them practice.
Right, and then with the actual contact hours you have, you're trying to cover new topics, right?
Yeah,
you're not spending that time diagnosing.
No, so the first week I do a recap, of algebra basically, but moving on from week 2 onwards, I have to move on to the next topic, because there's a curriculum that was set up in order for me to get to the topic of week 8. I need to get a move on, so to speak.
Yeah. So this is where right now, I mean, you're doing this work in Sowiso right now, and this is also something you've written about before, and we've talked about this earlier, and you kind of mentioned it right now with digital tools. You see a lot of potential in how technology can kind of replace this private tutor setting, which is the ideal thing you're striving for.
I'd say that right now, one of the biggest problems, at least in higher education when it comes to teaching math, is there is a pretty strong imbalance between, on the one hand, the student's demand for personalized instruction, and on the other hand, just the time that the teacher has to give to these students. So, and I think that that's something where digital technology can help to sort of restore that imbalance. So, I mean, in an ideal world, we'd either double the amount of teachers or half the amounts of students, just to make sure that each student gets more time with the teacher. But unfortunately, like the number of students is growing every year, while the number of teachers is remaining fairly stable. So we can't really tweak the numbers in order to restore this balance. So we need to figure out some new ways in order to do that, and I think technology can help in two ways there. So the first question that we ask ourselves is, well, is there any way that digital technology can help save the teacher time? So are there some tasks and things that we can automate so that the teacher has more time to spend on personalized instruction, or just more time to spend with students? So that's sort of the teacher side. And then the student side is the problem that we're trying to solve. What can we do with the help of technology in order to reduce the dependency of the student on the teacher? So is there any way that we can set up the learning material so that students are better able to work through the material on their own without intervention from the teacher?
Right, so the tool would kind of back up as their intervention.
Yeah.
Tool. So you were saying when it comes to integrating technology, you see two ways of how technology can help you. On the teacher side, it's more about saving time, and for the student side, it's more how you can help them when they have limited contact hours with the teacher.
Yeah. So on the one hand, how can we free up time for the teacher so he has more time to spend with his students? And on the other side is, what tools can we give to the students so they become less reliant on the teacher to help them?
Right. So on one hand, you're trying to increase the supply. On the other hand, you're trying to increase the demand.
Exactly. So in very economic terms, So that's exactly what.
All right. So then, if you go a bit more deeper into it, so for a teacher, how can a tool help?
So
save time.
I mean, we mentioned this a couple of times before, but. So one of the main struggles as a teacher is that you have a large group of students who everyone has their sort of unique profile of strengths and weaknesses. And ideally, as a teacher, you'd like to know beforehand what those strengths and weaknesses are.
Because if there are any large patterns, then you can kind of design the classes.
So of course, I mean, as I said, there's no real replacement for one-to-one instruction, but if you know that a large group of students is struggling with a particular topic, and that is something that you maybe can address in a lecture, or have your teaching assistants watch out for particular things. So, and that's one of the things that a digital tool can help you do, is sort of run an initial diagnosis of what the strengths and weaknesses are. Mm-hmm. So either with the help of a diagnostic test, or keeping track of their week-by-week progress. So that's the nice thing about computers, is that, or a digital tools, that you have access to things like automatic grading of homeworks and assignments, or you can give them an initial diagnostic test. So I mean, without a digital tool, if I give 100 students a test and I have to grade 100 tests, and then sort of take that as use that as an initial diagnosis of the strengths and weaknesses, and the computer can automate that system. Mm-hmm. So just by the virtue of automatic checking and automatic grading, things like diagnosing the profile of strengths and weaknesses of each student becomes much easier.
Right, so there you save time on the checking and grading, because especially with math, there is a right answer, so it makes it easier to actually make it into an algorithm. Mm. And on the other hand, on top of that, by making it automated, you can also have analyze that data and come up with actual analytics.
So it's much easier to monitor and evaluate the progress of your students. So whereas if you don't have access to that, so sort of at least the way a course is traditionally set up, is sort of the one moment where you're really testing your students' capabilities, or the sort of the clearest view that you get of your students' performance is all the way at the end of the course. So after the final exam is graded and the grades are in, then you can see, clearly these are the topics that the students are struggling with. But by then it's too late to intervene, right? So ideally you want to see week by week what are the topics that the students are struggling with, which students are struggling. So even figuring out whether someone is a high, mid, or low performer can be difficult to tell from the outside. Like without actually spending time with the student, it can be difficult to tell what a student is struggling with and why. Because the teacher is no longer needed for grading and sort of analyzing and diagnosing strengths and weaknesses, that can be automated, and the teacher can then use those automated reports to structure his or her class.
Right. So that's on the teacher side.
Yeah.
So one is that you can automate repeated tasks with the technology.
Yeah. So
when
even
it comes to grading.
Yeah. So even
test assignments.
So especially, like we mentioned with the biggest cohort of students, say your middle performers, like their biggest struggle is to just put in the work consistently. So ideally, you want to give them homework each week, and you want to make sure at the end of the week that they actually did their homework. But then as a teacher, you don't have time to check 100 students' homework. You can't have teaching assistants do it because you need 12 teaching assistants. So, using just paper and a textbook, it's not possible to, or it's not feasible to assign weekly homework and make sure that they do it. Whereas something when the homework is automatically graded, and as a teacher, like with the click of a button, I can get the report for the entire class. It's very easy for me to spot which topics the students are struggling with and which students are struggling.
Okay, so and then on the student side, how can?
Yeah, so and I guess the best way to present this is maybe to directly compare it to the textbook. So what changes when we move away from a paper textbook to a digital learning environment? And
So you're not talking about just a PDF now.
No. Like a PDF is nice. Sure, it's digital, but a PDF is text on screen instead of text on paper. So in that sense, didactically, nothing changes. Like it's just the background of where it is written on changes, but like the material itself wouldn't change from a textbook to sort of a PDF. So I mean, a textbook generally does two things. So the first is it explains certain topics. It presents the skills and then the rules that the students need to learn and provide examples to do so. And the other thing that textbooks do is they provide the exercises and the assignments that the students can use to sort of test their knowledge, make sure that they've actually mastered the things that they're supposed to learn. And so I mean I like to think of these as sort of the theory and exercises is probably the easiest distinction to make. So let's take the theory first, and because we're switching from a paper textbook to now a digital medium, we get access to new ways to present information. So whereas a textbook is limited to text and images, with a computer we can also make use of things like video, audio, and even animations. And these can really help give a different perspective on a particular topic. So not every not every type of information is processed equally well across a particular medium. So some things are easily presented written down, whereas other things are better presented visually, for instance.
Right. So, for example, a graph might be better than just
Right.
a paragraph.
Or even an animation. So I could if I write out, well, if I increase the x value here, then y is going to increase exponentially. Or I could create a small animation and give the students a slider where they can actually change values themselves, see how things change, making things more visible, more tangible by presenting it in different ways. And the second big benefit is that things like videos can be incredibly helpful for students as well. So even something like a recorded lecture has a lot more, has a quite a number of benefits over just attending the lecture. Once the lecture is recorded, you can pause it, you can rewind it.
Right, and then you don't have to kind of just be too busy writing notes when you're at
So that's I mean, that's what you see a lot, right? You're giving a lecture and you see everyone just frantically making notes. But it's very hard to sort of keep track of a calculation, of sort of actually getting on a top-level view of what's happening. If all you're doing is sort of copying, it's very hard to think and write at the same time. So that's where things like recorded videos can be very helpful. But also, one of the other things is, or video can be very helpful, is things like worked out solutions. So I think this is the biggest strength of a platform like Khan Academy, is that every topic comes with a worked out solution in the form of a video. And this can be much easier to process because if you just give someone the worked out solution like as a whole, it can be quite overwhelming. So especially as problems get more complex, they might involve anywhere from 10 to 20 smaller sub-steps. If you sort of just give them all in one go, it can be, I like to call it sort of symbol overload. Like I'm pretty good at math and I still struggle with this when there's too much symbols on the page. You just sort of, your eyes start darting.
Yeah, you don't even know where to start.
Right, and so that's something that's really nice if you sort of tape yourself working through an exercise, then there's a much more natural flow in sort of the tempo in which the information is presented, so it's often much easier to follow. So in that way, switching to a digital environment, making use of all the new ways in which we can present information can make certain topics easier to understand, or give students a better chance of.
Right. So it's one is that the way it's communicated could be made clearer through using a digital environment. And second one, which I think is equally beneficial, would be that it's more self-paced, right? So you can kind of go at your own. Yeah,
and that is cannot be understated how valuable it is for a student to go through things at their own pace. Some students will like everybody learns at their own pace, and it's very nice when you're not in an environment with 12 other children who are sort of rushing you by. Instead, you can just go home, make a cup of tea, get behind your computer, and just work through it at your own pace, pausing where it's needed, looking things up where it's needed. In that sense, it can help students pace their learning at a rate that's comfortable for them.
Right. So that's for the theory. And
right.
You said you split this into how it can benefit students for the theory and how it can benefit students for the exercises. So where did the exercises come in?
So, I mean, because we, now I'm speaking sort of as an author as opposed to as a teacher, so someone who writes and creates course material, is that you get access to a lot more tools when you use a digital medium to create these exercises. So for instance, just as an example, one thing we make extensive use of at Sowiso is a thing called randomized exercises. So instead of having an exercise with set values, we use a computer algorithm to randomly generate a particular type of exercise. So this, this creates a lot more practice material for students, but it also allows students to keep practicing a particular problem until they feel that they sufficiently mastered it. So one of the frustrating things that a lot of students encounter is that they need maybe 4 or 5 attempts at a problem in order to actually master it. But then by the time you've felt like, okay, now I've got this down, now the practice material has run out. So now you've done the exercise of the chapter, and now you're sort of looking for new practice material. So just by using the power of computers to randomly generate exercises, we can, the amount of practice materials just skyrockets.
Right, and there's not that much effort needed from the teacher or the student to like just sit there and come up with exercises which have already been solved, so they can double check, etc.
And the same thing is just like we can write an algorithm to generate a problem, we can also write an algorithm to generate a solution. So we can be solutions can be much more extensive than what you would generally find in a textbook.
So just with the base problem of just one problem, you can have infinite problems, and each of these problems could have all these solutions matched up too.
Yeah. So right. It takes more time to set up, but once it's set up, you can use the blueprint of an exercise to create as many slightly different copies as you
right.
want.
Interesting. And then you said once you do this, because the key requirement for any kind of mastery is practice. So this kind of unlocks that. To the right. And then what if you do it, but you're still not having a tutor there explaining things, right?
Yeah. So I guess one of the techniques that you use as a tutor a lot is something called guided practice. So basically you sit down next to a student and I'll have you make a problem, and as you go along, I'll sort of try to steer you in the right direction. So I'll try to point out small errors, or say, oh, okay, maybe we might want to look again at step 3. So you're sort of guiding them through the process. And although this is not something we can perfectly replicate with the computer, so a computer will never, at least now, is not able to do as good as the job as a private tutor, but we can sort of imitate it, because whereas the relationship between a book and a student is one way. So the student gets information from the book, but the book cannot process anything that the student writes down. And with computers, we can actually analyze a student answer. So instead of just saying, well, whether this is right or wrong, we can sort of analyze the student's answer and sort of backtrack to see what kind of mistakes might have happened, and that way we can give the student targeted feedback while they're practicing, without the need for me as a teacher to actually sit down next to them and having to spend time.
Right. So this is another way that it saves. This is how you lower the demand for help.
Right. So exactly. So this is one of the ways where we can sort of reduce the load on the teacher, and that is not to say that every student will now suddenly magically never need a teacher. Like that is not the goal. Our goal is not to replace the teacher. Our goal is to, if I can, with a modern digital tool, help maybe 20% of the class that they no longer need the teacher's intervention, and that is already a very huge gain for the teacher, right? So every student that is now able to work on their own, that's time that I can spend as a teacher on the weaker students, or students who need more attention, more personal guidance.
So far we've talked about the math problem and how you experience it and what this actually means for the teachers and what it means to the students. And you also talked a bit more about right now about how technology can help it, and it's Sowiso, for example, and how because you're using that in your classroom as well, right?
Yeah.
And then my biggest question here now is that, as a concluding remark, there's a lot of teachers, and you touched upon this already a bit, who are worried that this is going to replace them. This is going to replace teachers, and also there are people who say a computer can never do a job of an actual teacher helping someone out. So what would you say to these people? Like,
I mean, yeah, that's the same thing. Like if I give, let's say I give a carpenter, I give him an electric saw instead of a manual saw. That doesn't mean that the electric saw is able to replace the carpenter, right? It's just that we're trying to upgrade the teacher's tool set, so to speak. So we're trying to see if there are certain tasks that the teacher is now performing that we can take away, or sort of have a computer do them, and so the goal is never to replace the teacher. The goal is to sort of maximize the time that a teacher can spend with their students. Right. So it's always enabling the teacher instead of kind of empowering the teacher. So these things like automatic grading, automated reporting. I mean, who knows? Maybe you never know with technology, but let's say like for the foreseeable future, you will always have always need a teacher to help the students, and especially for the sort of the weaker students who not only need technical support but also emotional support. Yeah, that's not something that a computer can replicate. Sort of the human element, which is a big part of why tutoring is so effective, because it's very personal, it's very one-to-one, and those are things that we currently cannot replicate. I think that shouldn't be a priority to replicate either. Right. The priority is essentially to correct the supply and demand, and that's so to help sort of restore this imbalance that we're currently seeing in the classroom. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was really informative. You're very welcome. And I'll see you next time. All right.